Alongside other organizations, such as our recent guest, the Yankee Institute, Connecticut Voices for Children is one of the most cited think tanks in the Nutmeg State. But they brand themselves a little differently, as a think and do tank. They focus on equity, integrity, impact, community, and learning. Joining us today is Lauren Ruth, Research and Policy Director, and Patrick O'Brien, Research and Policy Fellow for Connecticut Voices. We'll talk about those priorities, the current legislative session, and more. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor at Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voices, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast, in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state and local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect consensus views of CCM or our member municipal leaders. Lauren and Patrick, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, happy to be here.
So, as we said in the intro, Connecticut Voices for Children brands itself as a think and do tank, which kind of suggests that you view your role a little bit differently than a standard think tank. Could you tell us a little bit about your organization and what sets it apart from other organizations? Lauren, start with you.
Sure, Matt. So Connecticut Voices for Children has been around for over 25 years in Connecticut. And our vision is to create a state that's thriving and equitable and where all children achieve their full potential. So the way we go about bringing this vision to life is through creating high quality research. That's the think part of our work, and policy recommendations that are coupled with advocacy. That's the do part of our title. So while research is really critical to understanding the problems that children and families face in Connecticut, it's really rare that a white paper in and of itself puts food on the table or helps kids graduate from high school. So that's why our organization couples doing research with strategic communications, with partnership and coalition building, and with policy advocacy. And that's just to ensure that the problems we identify that children and families are facing actually get solved. So first and foremost, we are a think tank, but we break from the traditional think tank model by heavily relying on our values to center communities in shaping our policy recommendations and in shaping our research itself. And the reason why we do this is to ensure that community experts and what they voice needing is actually what gets risen to the top.
Yeah.
So these pieces all together are why we chose to rebrand ourselves as a think and do tank.
Awesome. Often your studies, especially on education, are cited in news articles, op-eds. Why is the work of think tanks so important to good governance? Patrick, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Matt. So I'd say that as a think tank, Connecticut Voices contributes to good governance by providing essential oversight and information on the impact of public policy. So for example, most of my work focuses on tax policy. And this year, the Finance Committee alone, which is just one of several committees, considered more than 200 bills, most of which included multiple policy changes, written rather complex language. And add to that, elected officials sit on multiple committees, which considerably limits their time to focus on any particular bill and develop expertise. And likewise, the public's generally busy working at their jobs, raising children, living their lives, etc., which considerably limits their time to focus on public policy. So one key way that we contribute to good governance is simply by monitoring proposals and helping to inform elected officials and the public about what exactly those proposals will do and which ones we think would improve the lives of most of the state's residents, especially those that have been historically disadvantaged. And when the legislative session isn't underway, we spend a lot of time both developing policy recommendations and continuing to educate elected officials and the public on complex issues. So for example, over the past year, we developed several tax policy recommendations, many of which recently passed the Finance Committee. We also gave presentations to groups throughout the state in order to educate the public and policymakers about how the tax system contributes to economic injustice and how reforming the tax system would instead work to advance economic justice.
I would also add that when we develop our research and policy recommendations, we try to center community voice through developing projects that answer questions that are posed to us by community members, by reflecting the lived expertise of community members in how we collect our data. So through collecting qualitative data as well as quantitative data, and through the methodologies we use to analyze that data.
Mhm.
And then we try and co-create our policy recommendations with community leaders to ensure that the policies we're putting forth to the legislature are ones that are actually needed by communities, as opposed to ones that we as well-intentioned individuals might think are needed, but that might be a little bit off.
I guess on the well-intended individual sort of thing, a lot of the work that you do could be labeled as progressive. Do you view your organization as a partisan organization in the strict sense, and why does that matter?
No, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, which means that we're not aligned with a political party, and we don't raise funds for any individual politicians. Because our mission is to make Connecticut thriving and equitable for children, we often work with lawmakers from both of Connecticut's major political parties, because children are overwhelmingly a nonpartisan topic. That being said, one of our organizational values is equity, and unfortunately, some people would say that equity has become a partisan topic. One thing we know is that children who grow up in poverty have less access to the resources they need to grow up healthy. They're less likely to enjoy educational experiences that are positive and sufficiently challenging. And they're less likely to have a family system that has the financial resources that's so often needed for young people to transition to a stable adulthood. So we're trying through policy enactment to undo any contributions of state policy to these impacts of child poverty, irrespective of the fact that they have, to your point, become considered partisan. But we as an organization are very much nonpartisan.
And Patrick, is that important to what you do as well, the kind of the nonpartisan natures that allow you to do your job better?
Yeah, I think I'd agree completely with what Lauren said on that issue. I mean, I view largely as I'm trying to explain what the implications of tax policy are. And we've put forward proposals that I think have had bipartisan support in the past. I've seen proposals put forward by Republicans and Democrats that I think would make the state better. And so I don't view tax policy through a partisan lens. Other people may differ, but I think it's important that we take a nonpartisan position.
Excellent. And this kind of leads into one of our kind of main topics of conversation for today, the current legislative session. In your legislative priorities, you call for safe, affordable housing. And I doubt that many people kind of disagree with that on principle. But many current proposals have found quite a bit of opposition. What do you see as kind of the ideal affordable housing bill, and why are there so many detractors of a lot of these policies?
Sure. So I'll take the first stab at this one. Two bills that we supported this legislative session. There's one, House Bill 661, which is about a needs assessment and other policies regarding affordable housing development. That was put forth by the Open Communities Alliance. And then Senate Bill 1024, which is concerning zoning authority, design guidelines, qualifications of land use officials, and sewage disposal systems. And this was put forth by Desegregate CT. Taken together, these bills could really go a long way towards creating more safe, affordable, and equitable housing across the state. So just to give a little bit of background on Connecticut's current situation, and then what these particular bills would do before going into the opposition. Around 80% of Connecticut's low-income subsidized housing stock is located in only 15 of our 169 towns. I did some quick math this morning going on to a website specifically to look up low-income housing that's available. And of 473 available units, over 55% of them were located in 12 towns.
And is that more the larger urban areas usually, or where's a lot of this?
It's mostly what you would predict. It's Waterbury, New Haven, Hartford, East Hartford, Bridgeport, Norwalk, some in Stamford, some in New Britain. West Hartford is getting a little more, which I find heartening.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, of 169 towns, 12 is not a lot to carry the weight. research by Open Communities Alliance finds that this is really creating concentrated poverty and contributing to Connecticut being one of the country's most segregated states, which a lot of people wouldn't guess given that we're in New England.
Yeah.
About 50% of renters in our state are considered rent burden, which means that they pay more than 30% of their income just for housing. And that means that they have less money that can go towards essentials like putting food on their table and healthcare for their family. And they have less money that can go towards career growth and, things they need to really be able to keep going forward in their career, like transportation, childcare, and higher education. So Senate Bill 661 would contribute to developing more affordable housing, both rented and owned, as well as ensuring that the housing is equitably distributed across the state by implementing a fair share planning and zoning approach, which is similar to what's used in New Jersey. And it would ensure that new housing units won't continue to compound Connecticut's concentrated poverty and segregation. So basically, it works by generating an estimate of the need for affordable housing and then allocating it to regions and towns based on per capita median income, town wealth, the percent of multifamily homes that are already available in a town, and the town's poverty rate. So towns that have both greater means to afford more housing and a track record of not really contributing to affordable housing in the state would be asked to do more to meet the state's affordable housing needs over the next 10 years. So this has a pretty long runway. And the towns would have control over which changes they choose to make to zoning regulations to allow the development of more affordable housing, and which types of affordable housing they actually develop, because there are a multitude of ways that housing could be made that's more affordable.
Okay, it's not one size fits all solution.
It is not one size fits all, and towns would be able to choose the options that work for them. So some research we did this summer found that two particular zoning regulations towns may want to consider addressing are minimum lot size, which is the minimum size to build a new housing unit, and whether they allow the development of multifamily housing. So we did some research looking at the interaction of these two regulations within towns and found that some towns, by having regulations that require single family homes be built on large plots, some were 2+ acres in towns, and through not allowing development of multifamily housing, effectively ended up blocking out Black and brown families. They had well under the state average in terms of the number of Black and brown families who were able to live in that community, because these communities have been systemically blocked out of being able to build intergenerational wealth by our country, by our state. And so if you need to be able to buy a house with 2 acres, it really limits that to families who have a lot of wealth already. So then another bill, Senate Bill 1024, proposes just a total multitude of changes to land use laws that would make developing affordable housing easier in towns. So the changes include, but aren't limited to, supporting transit-oriented development and Main Street development, allowing for accessory dwelling units by right, and capping parking mandates. And these changes would help increase the diversity of what's affordable housing in Connecticut, and as well as just be able to allow more development, which would increase the amount. I should note that in committee, a lot of the original language was stripped out, and restoring the language, particularly related to transit-oriented and Main Street development, is critical to actually fulfilling the bill's purpose. So we are advocating for the restoration of that language. So then, to get to your point about opposition, I spent some time going through the opposing testimonies for both bills, and I think they fall into 2 categories. One category opposes specific language in the bills that could be edited to address fears about maintaining green space, ensuring that sewer systems can meet the needs of larger communities, ensuring that schools can serve more children, and other really valid infrastructure concerns, where towns would be responsible and can't make changes overnight. And I think these are solvable problems. I think this is the purpose of legislative session, is to be able to have these dialogues and really work through the language to find solutions that aren't one size fit all, but that still get to solutions in every space. You know, especially given how little land is impacted by transit-oriented and Main Street development.
Yeah.
I think these are very solvable problems. Transit-oriented development provisions would only impact 0.5% of land in the state. And Main Street development provisions would only impact 0.058% of land in the state. So these are small solvable.
That could result in fairly sizable results.
Yeah. But then another category of opposition throws around terms like local rule, local control, and town character. And it's just used to categorically oppose all proposals and to shut them down, shut down all possible ways of making more affordable housing within communities. And given that the two bills that I brought up leave a lot of room for local zoning boards to determine what works in their community and what they're going to change and what they're not going to change, as well as creates a diversity of types of affordable housing to be able to work with what the town already has going for it. I think having a categorical hard pass is more likely than we build racism or bias against low-income people moving into communities.
What are your thoughts on these bills? And also, I know you already mentioned that these bills were sponsored by some other organizations. How important is working with those other organizations to your efforts as well?
I'd say our partnerships are extremely important. We know that work gets done through people across the state doing it together. And certainly there are other people who know issues and have worked in this space. You know, they know issues better than we do. They've worked in this space longer than we do. And our team is small but mighty, but we can't do everything. And so really leveraging our partnerships and working to, as a state, deepen our knowledge is really critical to Connecticut Voices for Children. And so on the housing, while we provide research that can help inform recommendations, we don't tend to lead the charge on that policy. We tend to support our partners with providing the research that they say they need from us.
Excellent. So your role there is really to provide the materials for these organizations to make good policy.
Yeah, although I would also note that Open Communities Alliance and Desegregate Connecticut both have their own research arms in and of themselves. And so we try to work together to add on rather than to be redundant with the work that they're already doing.
Mutually beneficial relationships, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's great.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH LP 103.5 FM.
One of the more talked about proposals that you had voiced support for is the child tax credit. Where's that at currently?
So last week, a maximum $600 per child tax credit was included in the revenue package that passed the Finance Committee. It appears to have substantial political and popular support, so we are hopeful that the General Assembly and the Governor will pass it into law this year.
With the federal child tax credit that was recently increased, what would that $600 tax credit mean for Connecticut families?
Sure. So I think there are several benefits to creating a state level child tax credit along with the expanded federal tax credit. So let me just highlight just two. Okay. So first, creating the Connecticut child tax credit would help to offset the unfair tax burden on working and middle class families with children and make Connecticut more in line with the vast majority of states in the country. In particular, 42 states have a personal income tax on wage income. And 38 of those states have either a child exemption that reduces the amount of taxable income and or some form of a child tax credit. Okay. Of the remaining 4 states, 2 states, Missouri and North Dakota, don't have a child exemption simply because their income tax partially mirrors the federal income tax, and that temporarily removed the exemption and expanded the federal child tax credit in place. So this leaves only 2 states, Connecticut and Pennsylvania, that have an independent state income tax, but no child exemption or credit specifically designed to adjust for family size and help offset the considerable cost of raising children. And of those 2 states, I'll say that we're the only one that's a high cost of living state. Pennsylvania isn't. And so if you want to understand, like, I know this can sound a bit technical, but just in simple terms to understand why it's so important, we kind of did an analysis for several localities of what a family making $78,833, which is the median household income in Connecticut, so about $79,000. We did an analysis showing, like, what would you pay in the state income tax if you lived in other places? And some of the places that we picked were New York, which is the top destination for families actually leaving Connecticut. I know Florida gets all the attention, but New York is actually the #1 destination when you use the IRS data. And they have a higher top state income tax rate. And so they're viewed as a high tax state. So that's a nice comparison group. And another state that we picked was California, which is actually the 4th most popular destination for families leaving Connecticut. And it has the highest state income tax rate in the country. And so if you're looking at the median household income in Connecticut using that, about $79,000, we saw that and for a family with 2 children.
Family of 4. Okay.
Yeah, so family of 4, family with two dependents. So that family pays on average nearly $3,200 in the Connecticut state income tax. This is about $1,100 more than it pays in the federal income tax at that point. So by the time you get to 2 kids, you're paying more at the state level than the federal level. This is about $670 more than it would pay in the state income tax if it moved to New York, which again is the most popular destination for families actually leaving Connecticut. And this was really striking. It's about $2,400 more than the family would pay in the state income tax rate if it moved to California, which is viewed as an exceptionally high cost, high tax state, but it's much more friendly for, working and middle class families with their tax rate. And so if we create the Connecticut Child Tax Credit, this would reduce the family state income tax burden by $1,200 a year, $600 per child. And so this would bring it below the amount that it pays in the federal income tax. It would bring it below the amount that it would pay in the New York income tax. And it would, we'd still be above the California income tax, but we'd be much more competitive against it. So then the second benefit, I think, to creating the state child tax credit would be that it reduces poverty and boosts economic growth, which is critical because Connecticut, depending on how you measure it, has had either the worst economic growth or one of the slowest levels of economic growth, depending on how you measure it over the last decade.
Not good.
Not good, yes. And so this would really, research basically is pretty clear on this, that it would boost economic growth. And so in particular, Moody's Analytics, which is the firm that actually provides economic models for Connecticut's Office of Fiscal Analysis, they show that $1 tax cut in the form of a child tax credit, which again benefits primarily working middle class families, it has an overall direct and indirect expansionary effect on economic output equal to more than $1. All that means is simply is that it's moving throughout the economy, and so the overall effect for each dollar in that tax credit will boost the economy by more than $1 because it has this multiplying effect. In contrast,
I'm sorry. So people who would say, this sounds great, but how can we afford it? We're already, short of money in the state, whatever. In the long term, it actually generates more money for the state than it costs, is what you're saying?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So the second part of this point is a $1 tax increase, for example, on investment income, capital gains, or so on and so forth, which goes overwhelmingly to the wealthy. That has an overall direct and indirect contractionary economic effect on output equal to significantly less than $1. So what this means in really simple terms is that if you increase taxes on the wealthy to fund the child tax credit, and that's just a revenue neutral policy. So for each $1 increase on the wealthy to pay for this $1 tax on the credit, so it's a 1-for-1 increase, it has the effect of boosting the state's economy because each $1 in tax cuts for that child tax credit provides a greater economic boost than each $1 in tax increases on the wealthy creates an economic drag. So the overall effect is revenue neutral. The state could basically, for example, raise taxes by $300 million to provide a $300 million child tax credit, and that's entirely offsets, each component offsets the other, but the overall effect is that it boosts Connecticut's economy.
So people are looking at, our budgets in the future and looking at our, all the debts the state's got and are worried about that. They shouldn't be worried that this is going to put us even farther in the hole.
No, this is definitely one of those good policies that you can have a revenue neutral design that will end up basically in the long run will actually create more revenue, because if the economy grows, then it's easier for the state obviously to collect revenue from a faster growing economy.
Yeah, and also I think one of the points here is that the tax policy, this is complicated stuff. So even though on paper, California, you're saying, is the highest, that where exactly that's coming from is important to when we're talking about the stuff, that this policy would change where it's coming from, and that less of it would come from the middle class.
Yes. Well, so one of the important things, so why we picked, for example, New York and California as comparison groups is not only because there's significant outmigration to those states, but both of those states have versions of child tax credits and or exemptions that are basically in place. And that's why right now, like the median or middle class family is doing better off under their tax codes, even though they have a higher top income tax rate. So basically they're implementing in part what we're suggesting with this component of, if you raise taxes on the wealthy to fund this, which is a revenue neutral policy, it's going to grow your economy faster. And most states have some sort of an exemption to offset the cost of living. And this is, I mean, it's pretty simple with the idea that right now, if you're making $79,000 in Connecticut and you're a married family with no children, you pay the same amount in the state income tax as you do for a family with 2 children. But that family with 2 children has significantly more expenses. Their expenses are far greater. So their ability to pay those taxes is reduced. And so the federal income tax takes that into account. That's why your income tax burden goes down so much when you have children, because that cost of living is so expensive.
Okay, moving on a little bit. One publication that CT Voices recently published was More Than a Health Crisis, Long-Term Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Connecticut Youth and Families. What were some of the findings from this report, and did any of it shock you?
Sure. So this report was hot off the press. It just came out last week. We're very excited about it. And it looks at Connecticut Census House Pulse Survey, income and employment data, rent and food security data, and education data from September of 2020 through March of 2021. Okay, so it gives us a very current, up-to-date look at the longitudinal impacts of what's happening with the pandemic. Unsurprisingly, we found that young adults under the age of 25 are struggling with income and employment, especially given that the industries hardest hit are hospitality, food, and other tourism, other industries that are more attractive for young people, and people are able to get their foot in the door, really. And we found that they're putting off higher education plans because of the cost. We found households with children are more likely than households without children to report income loss, trouble making rent, and food insecurity. For many of the reasons that Patrick just described, their cost of living is just a lot higher. And also they had so many more demands during the pandemic than households without children. And, you know, this hasn't been easy for anyone, but it's been especially hard for parents. And across the board, we saw that the Black and Latinx households in Connecticut are suffering from job loss, pinched incomes, worries about eviction, and lack of access to resources necessary for educating their children. None of these results are surprising, which is really sad. Perhaps the most surprising finding was that adults aged 25 through 36, so the generation that was hit hard by the Great Recession, was also struggling, very close to what young adults are struggling with. So they're struggling with employment, income, and housing stability as well. So now we have 2 generations of young people in Connecticut who have been impacted by recessions, one that's been doubly impacted by 2 recessions back to back, without sufficient economic recovery. And this gives us some real reasons to be concerned about the state's long-term well-being, as our young people aren't able to build wealth right now. And more people are not experiencing the gains from the supposedly recovering economy that we keep hearing about. You know, stocks are booming, and yet people under the age of 36 are wondering if they're going to be able to pay next month's rent.
Your average person working in a restaurant may not have a amazing stock portfolio that's doing great right now.
So for these reasons, we really called for and advocated for intentionally prioritizing equity and the well-being of young people and families in the state's pandemic recovery plans, which to date, we haven't seen a lot of conversation about how are we going to help young adults and young parents.
In your report you published, there were 6 overarching recommendations, some of which we've already talked about, affordable housing, tax credit. But how do you feel about some of the reopening plans for the state, and what should be done in the coming months as more and more people are getting vaccinated?
Yeah, so this is probably the part of our paper that we hadn't ventured into so much before. But when we were seeing who was impacted, we felt like we needed to speak out about how the state is reopening. So I first want to point out that Connecticut has really been one of the nation's leaders in public health response to the pandemic. And that's something that our policymakers and our citizens who are still masking up, still not going to parties, that's something we should be proud of. But our response has also not been equitable, which is no secret. So we're really concerned that opening the state before large percentages of its residents have been able to receive a full vaccination will contribute to these inequities, especially as we're seeing that young people, families with children, and people of color are especially struggling from economic insecurity right now. And these are all the groups that have been left out of the vaccine response so far. So, young people just recently were open to getting the vaccine, but there hasn't been enough time for people under the age of 40 to have gotten both vaccines at this point. And we're worried about these individuals returning to work, traveling out of state, and having large gatherings before, people under or 16 to about 40 have been able to be vaccinated, while children are still unable to be vaccinated at all. And with strains of COVID spreading that are coming out to be more harmful to children. And while many of our Black and Brown communities still have limited access to vaccines. So these groups are just now starting to get vaccinated. They're not fully vaccinated yet. Children aren't vaccinated at all. And the whole process, beginning to end, takes at least a month and a half. And some people are still even waiting to get their first dose. So as tempting as it is, we really can't return to business as usual yet. And we can't pull back on the financial support and employment support we've been giving to people in the meantime, until we get towards that herd immunity, which we really don't have right now.
So good news, we're on the right track. It's encouraging. We should all be glad these vaccines are here, but the work isn't done yet. We're not at the finish line quite yet. And it sounds like one of your concerns is getting to those communities that currently are under vaccinated at a lower rate, and to figure out how to get to them. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, which I know Governor Lamont is really working on that right now. But as I said before, children aren't able to get vaccinated at all. And I haven't seen a solution to that on the horizon yet. So I think for our business communities, we would encourage them to really maintain those security measures that they have, such as limiting the number of people that can be inside a business at once, requiring protective masks, creating barriers between guests, and circulating air, having windows open, fans going, etc. But also allowing their workers who aren't fully vaccinated and parents to continue having some latitude in how they work. As we also would encourage our state government officials to continue closely monitoring the situation and really not pull the trigger on being back to normal until most of our residents are protected from the virus and until we have a solution for young children.
Patrick, what are some of your thoughts on reopening and COVID, either from a tax perspective or just as a person living in Connecticut?
So I'll I think, address the economy. I think so far Connecticut's done pretty well, given the tough situation that we've had over the last year of trying to manage, balance both the health aspects of this and our economy. We've also fortunately received a lot of great support from the federal government, so that's giving us, I think, very substantial leeway in how we move forward and how we address this reopen and everything. So I think with what Lauren addressed, that I think it's important to balance both the economic effects and the health effects. And fortunately, I think we're in a position now where we've had the support on the economic side from the federal government and just from, the booming stock market and different revenues that we've been collecting from that we can, I think, give the needed balance to the non-economic aspects of it that would perhaps be a bit more difficult to balance if we were in a different fiscal situation.
Yeah. And so from what I'm hearing from you, it does sound like the numbers do show that federal help was very important to a lot of people. Like, it did make a difference, right?
Yes, it definitely made a big difference. And just even our state revenues, just our projections have constantly gone up over the past year. And that was due in part to earlier federal support and unemployment insurance benefits and so on and so forth. But yes, overall, we're in a lot better position than we thought we'd be in a year ago when we had the consensus revenue forecast, and we were looking at like multi-billion-dollar shortfall for many years. So we're much better positioned than we thought we were going to be a year ago.
I mean, it's got to be encouraging on some levels that, good policy and good programs like that can have results, the intended results on some level.
Yeah, so I should say, so I think we're better off than we thought we would be, but I don't want to be too optimistic in the sense that there's a lot of work still to be done.
It didn't fix everything, but it did help.
Yeah, so we're in a better position than perhaps we thought, like just from the fiscal perspective, than we thought we would be a year ago. But I think there's still a lot of important work to do. But it puts us in a position that we can, I think, address some of these health issues with greater weight than would otherwise be the case, perhaps.
Do you think that Connecticut is poised to take on the challenges of the coming months, years, from an equity viewpoint, an economic viewpoint, education? What are we doing? What can we be doing? What should we be doing?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to the main thing I've been emphasizing, so talk about the tax side. And so I think it's really important, I think, for people to understand that there are three different types of tax systems that you can have in general. One is a regressive system, which means essentially that working middle-class families pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the wealthy. A proportional tax system would be everyone pays the same percentage of their income in taxes. And a progressive tax system means that the wealthier pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than working middle-class families. And Connecticut has a regressive tax system. So what that means is essentially that the burden for funding programs right now is on working and middle class families. And so if you're going to create a new program to help working and middle class families and then fund it through a system that disproportionately burdens them, you're already hurting those families before you even appropriate the money and get the program in place that's going to help them. So the key idea is that really we need to restructure our tax system so that we have a progressive tax system. So any new programs that are put in place aren't being disproportionately funded by working middle class families and hurting those families before the program can even go into effect and help provide support. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we think two key components to this are expanding their earned income tax credit and creating a child tax credit, which together would help make Connecticut's tax system less regressive, would move it more in the progressive direction because it would cover both working and middle class families. And if you reform Connecticut's tax system so it becomes more progressive, then that has the combined effect of both helping working middle class families on the tax side and making sure that it's not undercutting any new programs that are put into place that are also designed to help those families.
Lauren?
So I would just tack on to that by saying that I think Connecticut does have the potential to really bounce back and get better, even than before the pandemic. But we're going to have to overcome two really big issues in Connecticut. And one is maintaining motivations and lesson learned instead of going back to being the land of steady habits.
Yep.
And the other is just how interdependent our citizens in Connecticut and our cities truly are with each other. If there's anything that a virus that spreads person to person should show us, it's that we're really connected and very quickly. Coronavirus started in one town in Connecticut and quickly spread across the state. And we're also interdependent in the way that we support each other. The wealthy have in the state generally been okay in this pandemic. And part of the reason is because they've been able to work from home while our low income and our community of color are still our frontline workers who are fighting the pandemic through being nurses, home health care workers, grocery store workers. They're putting their bodies on the line and their families' bodies every single day. And so the reason why Connecticut hasn't fallen apart is because of these communities that keep our entire economy stable. You know, from a public health perspective, from an economic perspective, there's all sorts of lessons we can learn about interdependence and about the way our communities interact in ways that we don't even recognize on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. You know, it's going to take everyone working together to recover from this crisis situation. Mm-hmm. And a recent report shows that the crisis goes way deeper than the coronavirus. So our state's begun some really important conversations about equity and community, but we're going to need people pitching in from all over to move this from conversation to action.
Yeah. Patrick, any final thoughts?
So I'll just add a bit of context. I think we've already seen that the lesson has been learned apart on the federal level. I mean, the response that we've seen to this pandemic-induced recession is significantly different than the response that we saw to the Great Recession. And so, I mean, if you go back through our history, often the first response kind of is a crack in the established approach to governing, and the second kind of downturn, it's like you learn your lessons, and so in this one we've had a much more robust response in the federal level, and that's obviously impacting the resources that we have available at the state level, and so hopefully we'll also see this play out at the state level as well. A very robust response.
So do you credit some of what the federal government has done right this time to lessons learned from the Great Recession?
Oh, I think that's almost indisputable. Yes, like that's both on the fiscal policy front. The government has had a much more robust response, and it's also been on the monetary policy front. The Fed has been more aggressive in addressing this issue and their long-term handling of it than they had in the Great Recession. So on the federal level, we've seen definitely lessons have been learned, and hopefully we see the same at the state level.
Well, Lauren, Patrick from Connecticut Voices for Children, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for having us, Matt.
We'd like to thank our guests, Lauren Ruth and Patrick O'Brien of Connecticut Voices for Children. I'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, which you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.